So the world has changed since we last talked, and I definitely did see you go on some Twitter rants. And I feel like this story is pretty close to you. So I really wanted to get you on here as a historian, right? Like to get your take on what's going on with the Russia-Ukraine war. Like what are your thoughts on that?
Oh man, where the hell do I begin? So I've been following this thing for a long time, right? And I've been following since like 2013, 2014, when stuff was getting tense originally. That's when the original invasion of Crimea happened, because I happened to be seeing, a Russian Ukrainian girl at the time and talking to her family about it. And her family had sort of all sorts of political beliefs in it. People that liked Putin, people that didn't like him. And so I got interested, and since then I've been following the situation and getting closer to Ukraine. And I recently just published a piece about it, which, some of the stuff was a bit too hot to handle and got edited out. But as long as you have me here, I can say whatever. I mean, starting off at like the top level, yeah, it's an invasion. Russia decided to invade. It's a patently illegal, barbaric invasion, right? Like everybody knows that. But under the surface, it's an invasion that first started out as a civil war. Ukraine has had a culture war for about 30 years that has played out in two different coups, more or less, of governments, which have seen both Russian and American involvement. And this finally bubbled to an all-out shooting in 2014, when finally the big revolution, which is called Euromaidan, happened. So I can start anywhere in there. In that, I can start all the way from the early 20th century, explaining what the hell Ukraine is, if you want me to.
Dude, actually, let's go all the way back. Let's go all the way back. Because my understanding, my take, right, is, and again, to reiterate what you said, I am not taking a pro-Russian stance. I'm just looking at it through the lens of history, right? And so, if I'm assuming you're talking about when you say early 20th century, and maybe you're going further. I start in the 80s with the reunification of Germany, and part of that agreement was that we would not expand NATO further eastward. And since then, we've let 3 countries in, and then I go from the war in Yugoslavia and our involvement with them, and that, and like kind of this giant crescendo effect where the Russians are looking at the United States as a superpower, saying, fuck you. You're not talking about us, about the Slavic people, which is our sphere of influence. And you've lied to us on 3 separate occasions. We can't trust anything you say. And so that's kind of, my understanding of it. And I'm anxious to see if you're going to go further back or are we starting from the same place?
Yeah, there's 2 levels of the situation, right? There's like the domestic Ukrainian conflict, which does have international involvement. And then there's the great power games, which is what you're talking about. You're talking about like NATO, Russia, the United States. And with the NATO thing, like, yeah, I'm on your side. Like Russia has big reason to dislike the United States, right? Like after the Soviet Union fell, essentially we were world hegemon. The world was prostate and we could remake it in any fashion we could. And what we told the Russians was, what we're going to do is we're going to bring in people from, our economic consensus in the IMF, and we're going to do something called shock therapy, which is a quick transition to neoliberalism. All of your state assets are going to be sold off and are going to be instantly privatized. And this destroyed the Russian economy. Like life expectancy for Russian men went from something down like 62 to 58 in like 3 years. It like fell like in an insane amount. The Russians suffered a depression worse than the Great Depression in the United States. It was an era rampant with like gangsters and corruption and murder and mobs. Hell, even the father of someone I knew who was he was a doctor in Russia. He became like a card shark during that time period, working like at a casino. So it's just like a very bad time. Where Russia trusted the United States to help them out during this transition. And what we essentially did is we unleashed the worst tendencies and vultures of the world financial system in that country. Now, at that same time, we help President Boris Yeltsin, who is, a degenerate alcoholic whose brain was basically pickled. And in 1994, Yeltsin is having an election, and he's about to lose. He's polling at like a 2%, and so he calls Bill Clinton on the phone, and he's like, and these have been declassified, and he's like, hey, I'm going to need a bunch of things from you. So first of all, I'm just going to need millions of dollars just for my campaign. Mm-hmm. And Clinton's like, well, I can't do that. We can't send you millions of dollars. So where will we get that from? So he's like, okay, if you can't do that, I'm going to need something else from you. I'm going to need you to hold back on this NATO thing. Now, like you mentioned, there was a sort of like a behind the thing deal where I believe it was the president of NATO at that time and said that it wasn't going to expand further into Germany. And this was said to Gorbachev. Yep. Now we're at Yeltsin. And this is by the time that NATO already said it might expand. And Yeltsin already sent an open letter out the year before saying, we don't want it to expand, but if it is going to expand, it has to include us or we have to be part of that deal. And so he's already on record saying that. And so he's about to lose this 94 election, and he calls Bill Clinton. One of the things he asks of Bill Clinton is, please hold back on this NATO thing. Because if I'm shown that I'm doing nothing on NATO, my people are going to throw me out. And so Bill Clinton actually relents. He stops talking about NATO expansion for a while, and he doesn't give Yeltsin like the millions of dollars, but he speeds up an IMF loan to Yeltsin for like $10 billion, which Yeltsin uses to more or less win the election. So we have, right away in 94, there's a recognition between the presidents. Earlier on, they don't want NATO expansion. In 94, Yeltsin is saying, I cannot win if I am not shown to be doing something about NATO expansion. Mm-hmm. In 2001, Putin apparently privately asks Bush if he could be part of NATO in order to fight terrorism now, which was like the big thing of the 2000s for fighting terrorism. Mm-hmm. In 2007, the year, or 2007, the year where Putin is named Time Person of the Year, he says that NATO cannot expand further into Ukraine and Georgia. And then 1 year later, in 2008, NATO says we're expanding into Ukraine and Georgia. So like that's established. Like it's a long history of us treating Russia and their and their goals with contempt. Yep. However, right, like you can be someone that says they no longer have a sphere of influence, right? Like this is all based on sphere of influence theory. It's that, the big fish gets to act strong around its smaller neighbors, just as we sort of impact what Mexico might do, right? Like we set here are the policy choices that would be amenable to us in Mexico and in South America, and Russia wants to do the same thing. But to be a moral person, you can't make those allowments for your country and not make them for another country. So either you reject that theory in its entirety, you accept it, or you make the special claim that only we get to do it. Mm-hmm. So that I'm not sure about. I don't know which side I land on, but I do think that provoking them with NATO in the eye was a mistake. And now Ukraine is in part paying for it.
And I agree with you, but I do, and I want to get back to Russia, but I do want to dig into that because that is an interesting talking point. Like, because I do think, right, like primarily based off of, a historical context, the United States sphere of influence has always been the Americas, right? Like that is
the Monroe Doctrine.
The Monroe Doctrine. Anyone fucking comes to invade Cuba or does anything, we're at war immediately. And then I believe, and I could be wrong here, it is the next like Asian, like Southeast
Pacific,
Asia. The South Pacific is our other, like that is our objective. Then the last is Europe. And correct me if I'm mistaken, the Russian sphere of influence has always been, Russia proper, some in Asia, right? Particularly like back in the day, China and North Korea, all the communist
they fought a war
states.
Against Japan.
Mm-hmm, exactly, the Russo-Japanese War, and they lost that, which was crazy. But and then the other part were the Baltics, and all the
Mm-hmm.
Slavs, right? That was a large reason that World War One started. Was like, no matter what, we're bailing out the Slavs. That is our moral duty as a nation to help our people.
Yeah, the Caucasus, the Turkic areas, their
Yes.
aim has always been to expand into the Black Sea, and at
Hmm.
that point, against the Ottoman Empire,
Yes.
against
Yes.
the Turks.
And from a, if we got to take it back even further, like just to look at the paranoia, Russia is a terribly complicated country to defend militarily because of the large grassland leading all into Moscow. And to build a defense mechanism would be horribly expensive. So, what they wanted to do is have a bunch of buffer states so they can tell where someone's invading and then they could send forces to stop that. Right. So,
Yeah.
that's really been their MO for hundreds of years.
Both
And that
Napoleon
could,
and Hitler marched
yeah,
through
yeah.
Ukraine
So
to invade.
this is an area that has deep historical trauma and a history of atrocities, and they don't want to see that now. Now, from their perspective, right? Like we're pointing a gun at their head. We've lied to them, and then not only that, they've asked numerous occasions. You pointed to a time in with Bush in the I would say
Yeltsin asked,
and
and Putin asked in 2001.
someone asked in the 70s too. The Soviet Union asked in the 70s as well. And I can't remember when. I know that that's true, John. Maybe try and find that. Maybe not, though. But they've asked numerous times. So, and we've said no. So that to them, that's like, so we're just not in this club and everyone's ganging up on us. Like this doesn't sit right. So just from their perspective, right? But back to we're off. I'm off on a tangent. But back to like, do you agree? Like, do you have a problem with us, the United States, being like kind of the like this lone superpower, right? Like we have hegemony. Is that something? Where do you fall in that? Because that's a tough question, right? Being of Cuban origin, born in Cuba, right? You've seen the nastiness of the fucking sanctions, and they don't fucking work. But like, what is your opinion on that?
Man, that's $1 million question, right?
It is.
Yeah, I'd have to be entirely honest. I'm bipolar on this subject because I think it's sort of on a case by case basis, right? Like, so my formative political years, at least, happened during the Iraq War, right? And I think at this point, I mean, if you believe anything we ever did in the Middle East at this point is good, you're insane. Right? Like nothing we did there under any guise of spreading democracy or whatnot, it didn't work. We weren't actually spreading democracy. We weren't accounting for like whatever geopolitical conditions they had. More recently, we went to Libya, and Libya is now what? It's a warlord state with open slave markets. It's like the capital changes hands with like every now and then I play a game where I Google to see which warlord is in charge of Libya, and like it changes every year. Syria was awful with the whole arming of the moderate rebels thing, when in reality a bunch of like the stuff we sent ended up in the hands of like ISIS and other similar militants. So completely bungled. Exporting in the 21st century, exporting American democracy. I don't know. I don't. It's. I mean, it didn't work in Vietnam. It traditionally, when we say we're exporting American democracy, realistically, we're doing, especially with a lot of the weaker countries, is plundering them. We're coming there with corporations and companies and setting up institutions and presidents who are friendly to our financial interests. And this is sort of obscured in a way because of the successes that we had after the Second World War in certain areas. For example, we did pass the Marshall Plan that helped rebuild Europe. Now, at the same time, we sent a bunch of money to parties so communist parties would lose, right? Particularly in Italy, we kept the Communist Party from taking control. And if you're an anti-communist, which I am, I think, everything is going to have to, because I'm of two minds about this, so everything is going to have a little caveat. Then that was a good thing, right? The Marshall Plan and keeping Western Europe non-communist was a good thing. And the successes of the occupation of Japan and South Korea, right? A lot of ugly stuff happened there. And for a while, we propped up actual dictators. Like South Korea was a dictatorship until like the 80s. But, Japan and South Korea now are developed countries with blossoming economy, well, kind of. South Korea has a blossoming economy. Japan is stuck. And, cultural powerhouses and whatnot. So there have been some successes, but by and large, it's been failure. So I do think it's on a case-by-case basis because there's no iron rule, but I think more often than not, it is best to simply stay out of other people's problems. More often than not, especially now whenever we go to a country, there's like 15 NGOs who all have different interests and are all trying to get their sons or daughters a position on some board. And there's, we employed paramilitaries in Iraq and in Afghanistan. We employed the hell were they called? Blackwater? Yeah, we employed Blackwater USA, just disgusting stuff we get up to. And what bothers me more is that these things have become such a part of the American government and of the way the gears just how the United States operates, that they don't have democratic accountability, right?
Nope.
The people don't really vote on what shape a military operation is going to take or what an occupation is going to look like. This is deep state stuff. This is stuff that just happens behind the background that's taken care of by undersecretaries and interest groups and things like that. So it's an entirely unaccountable, it's the military-industrial complex, right? And it's entirely
100%.
unaccountable to any type of American democracy. It's just something that runs in the background like ambient noise.
Yes.
And that's a very ugly thing.
It's a business.
Yeah, just an example to end it there is that in Afghanistan, right? The Afghanistan papers came out. The New York Times released them. Not one person was fired. Not one person lost their job. We learned no lessons. There was more talk about whether or not Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan was well done or not than of the 20 years of failed occupation. Mm-hmm. And so at some point, I think we have to ask the question, if these systems have no democratic accountability to us, perhaps they shouldn't be running at all.